It's a distinct pleasure to welcome you to Ottawa this morning. And I can't help but think that there is some symmetry, if you will, in where we are meeting today and some of the concepts or some of the views that I will espouse and articulate this morning, because many of you may not realize that after a great fire which destroyed our Houses of Parliament earlier in the 20th century, the House of Commons, the Houses of Parliament, actually moved to this building. And where you're sitting today was, in fact, the parliamentary precinct. The House of Commons met within these walls. They didn't look quite the way they do today. But so this is a building that is rich and redolent with history, and it's quite, I think, appropriate in some respects as we talk about public policy, social policy, polity in general, that we do so in an environment which itself encompass deliberations and conversations that spoke to the need for appropriate public policy. Let me begin, though, by suggesting that many of us bring to our understanding of those things that contribute to health and well-being a variety of misguided assumptions, prominent among which is the fact that we enjoy our 3 years of life plus, as a consequence of the ministrations and the skills and the sophistication of medical practice and hospitals and institutions of care and underwater photon-generated nuclear probe, laser-guided technological approaches to health. And nothing could be further from the truth. And despite the fact that I and my colleagues would be delighted to take credit for the fact that life expectancy and overall levels of health have improved significantly in the last century, that, in fact, is a concept that represents an error. And this slide, I think, represents, provides a fairly dramatic portrayal of that reality, because this slide shows the decline in deaths from tuberculosis that occurred over about 135, 150-year period. And what you see in that graph is that the number of deaths from tuberculosis, and by the way, you can substitute virtually any infectious disease on this graph, the slope of the curve will be remarkably similar. What you see, though, is that the decline in deaths began 50, 60 or more years long before we had any clue about what caused tuberculosis. And more than 115 or 120 years before we had any ability to treat tuberculosis. And so that the contributions of medical care, medical science, health professionals, etc., only emerges at the tail end of that curve on the right-hand side of this particular screen. And of course, what that graph reveals is that there's a whole array of changes in the environment. The environment, the social environment, the physical environment, the cultural environment, the nature of the culture itself that give rise to varying levels of health or, conversely, disease. And we've lost sight of the fact that this kind of reality operates in the 21st century just as it did in the 20th. Now, not far from here is an area in Ontario where I grew up. It's about 45 miles to the southeast. It's not quite the end of the world, but you can see it from there. And in this tiny little hamlet, we were all too well aware of what those sophisticated people in Ottawa did, and if you managed to scrape up enough money once or twice a year, you might be able to go to Ottawa for a big time of dance and a movie. I mean, you get the picture. But notwithstanding that kind of nostalgic recollection, this part of the province, and that part of our region in particular, has distinguished itself virtually from the time this nation developed as having the highest, among the highest rates of disease and the factors and forces that contribute to disease of anywhere in Ontario and in many respects in Canada. So these youngsters you see incarcerated behind desks in their school in Eastern Ontario at the turning point of the last century face an onslaught of epidemics of infectious disease. And the death rate from tuberculosis was the highest in Cornwall in Eastern Ontario, the region that surrounded it, of any area in the province. And I want you to remember that, because in a few minutes we're going to talk about other factors and other issues and other forces that can impel and cause the development of various states of health or disease and lack of well-being. And Rudolf Virchow, who is a great German pathologist whose name is known to every medical student virtually around the globe, was a very interesting German scientist. And he headed, in his great German university, what was called then the Department of Political Medicine, which with Teutonic frankness described what was the important series of imperatives that underlay the activities of that department. It was recognized, and Virchow recognized, that political decisions could make changes in the environment which were conducive towards or detrimental to the health of the community. And we sanitize language. So now we have departments of community health and epidemiology. And sometimes I think it would be a whole lot more robust and a whole lot more rigorous and a whole lot more realistic if we rediscovered some of the realities that were known to our colleagues a century or more ago. But Virchow pointed out that the history of epidemics throughout the history of mankind has been the history of changes in human culture. And anything that contributes to a distortion or a disruption of human culture will ultimately find expression in changed patterns of disease in that culture or in that society. And in my professional lifetime, we have seen some dramatic distortions and disturbances in human culture. Those young, healthy, active, playful-looking children have been replaced by a different kind of contemporary child. And that transformation is not just something that occurred serendipitously. It did not come out of the ozone or the ether. It came about as a consequence of some very distinct and very now well-described changes in our communities, in our social structures, in our environment, in our attitudes. I practice in an area of medicine in which we're concerned about hardening of the arteries, if I can use that term. I am as much disturbed by hardening of attitudes and the degree to which we accept that certain things are immutable, unchangeable, can't be modified, can't be addressed in any kind of meaningful way, is a recipe, I would argue, for public health disaster. So let me impose upon you for the next few minutes by describing some of the features that characterize a contemporary Canadian child's, young adult's, adolescent, teenager population. This, I know you find it astonishing that someone so youthful would admit to this, but this is the year I graduated from medical school. And in that period of time, throughout my professional lifetime, there have been an unbelievable array of changes. But I think it's very particularly significant that the year I graduated from medical school, a scientist, a colleague in the province of Saskatchewan, was publicly saying, for the ordinary Canadian child, physical fitness is a decreasing function of age from the moment they begin to sit behind a desk in their schools. This is not something that came about in the last 4 or 5 or 10 years. We have had individual scientists, perceptive and insightful like Don Bailey, who've been trying to make this point for 3.5 decades, and they have been ignored. And the degree to which they have been ignored is in part one of the reasons why we confront an epidemic of a very different kind in 2010. So let me just point out how Canadian children have changed, if you will, just in approximately a 30-year period. And this is data drawn from Statistics Canada. But here you see the characteristics of a child, of this 12-year-old boy in 1981, as compared to the characteristics of a child in 2007, 2009. And you immediately see that the child's height has increased. That's a good thing. As generally as societies flourish and as socioeconomic circumstances become more favorable, the height of a population increases. Let me give you a classic personal example. When I graduated from high school, I was the tallest player in our high school basketball league.